You're listening to the DolphinsTalk.com podcast network. Welcome to Dolphins Talk Weekly, your one-stop audio breakdown of all of this week's Miami Dolphins news. Now, here is your host, Kevin Dern.
This episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly is brought to you by Caneswear. Caneswear is the place to go for officially licensed apparel for the Miami Dolphins, Miami Heat, the Hurricanes, Florida Panthers, and all of the professional and college teams in South Florida. Looking for the latest jersey, a birthday gift, or the newest hat to hit the market of your favorite South Florida team? Check out Caneswear for their overwhelming selection of sports apparel. Located at 2655 South University Drive in Davie, Florida, Caneswear has it all. Not in South Florida? No worries. Visit Caneswear.com to shop their inventory from the comfort of your home, and they'll ship to you. International fans too. Caneswear.com is the spot that Miami fans shop. That's Caneswear.com, Caneswear.com. And welcome back to the latest episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly. I'm your host, Kevin Dern. You can follow me on X at KevinMD4. You can follow along with the show on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and DolphinsTalk.com. And be sure to check out all the other great articles and podcasts on DolphinsTalk.com. You can find them there, YouTube, Spotify, same places I just mentioned. And pretty excited as I record this. It's Thursday night, so preseason has begun in earnest. There's 2 games tonight. And I actually got to go see the Bengals practice this past Saturday. And we'll talk a little bit about that later in the show as it relates to the Dolphins. Unfortunately, I had a show lined up to record Sunday night, but my 5-year-old fell off the monkey bars and broke a wrist. So you're kind of getting both of these episodes crammed into one. So with that in mind, tonight's sort of rundown of the show, if you will, we're going to do a whiskey segment here, although it's not a new one. We'll talk about the O-line additions briefly, and then we'll do 2 position groups instead of 1 tonight. We'll do wide receivers, and then we'll lump the secondary into one together, corners and safeties. I'll talk about the Bengals practice and some of the things that I noticed as it relates to the Dolphins. And then we'll touch on the preseason depth chart as we're just a few days away from the game against the Bears. And then I believe they have at least 2, possibly 3 joint practices with the Lions next week. And I think that's probably going to be the litmus test of the preseason is, can you go up to Detroit, minus 1 starting offensive lineman for the moment, and hang with a team that's, been nearly unbeatable the last couple years until injuries have kind of derailed their season. So a good benchmark for the Dolphins. Kind of the same way in 2023, they had the joint practice and preseason game with Philadelphia and kind of held their own. So we'll see what happens this week. Whiskey segment. This one, we're just trying to get to the bottom of a bottle here. It's Macallan, but don't get too excited. Nothing fancy. It's Macallan 12, the double cask. I actually found this pretty cheap at Costco, of all places. It was like $60 for the bottle. I think we've done this on the show before. Not one of my favorite scotches. It's a Highland Scotch. You're going to get a lot of oaky flavor to it, and pretty overrated in my opinion, which I kind of get the prevailing sense with a lot of Macallans is they're a little overrated unless you get something that's like old, like 21 years aged or older, which with 2 kids right now, that's not in my budget at the moment, but we'll see. And it's a nice, smooth, kind of traditional Highland Scotch. You're going to get, the oak flavor, a little bit of honey and heather, a little bit of spice note at the end. Like this one, to me, it's a nice, easy drinking bottle, especially if you can find it affordably priced, like I did at Costco. I'd give it like a 3.3 out of 5. So into why you're here, the meat of the show, the Dolphins content. So Since we had the last episode, the Dolphins have made 2 offensive line additions, one of whom was on the original list of 3 names I gave you way back before the start of free agency. And if you remember, they've already signed one of the names. That was James Daniels back in actual free agency. They've signed Daniel Brunskill. And then the third name was Will Hernandez, who's still out there on the market. But Daniel Brunskill, obviously familiar with Mike McDaniel in this offense from his time with the 49ers. He started games there at right guard. Played last year for Tennessee, which is a bit different of a system. And played quite a bit at center for the Titans. He's also played tackle in his career. Was with McDaniel when he was with Atlanta. That was the team he broke into the league with. So one of those guys that can sort of play 2 positions really well. Probably can also jump in at left guard if you need it. I don't know that you'd want him to ever jump in at tackle, but he has played it. He has played right tackle before. So I like the Brunskill addition because to me, like if you look at how their offensive line is constructed, he would be the top interior guy, whether it's guard or center, that I would bring in off the bench if you had an injury. Fortunately for the Dolphins, knock on wood, going into this game against the Bears, Jonas Savaiinaia, Aaron Brewer, and James Daniels are all out there practicing. They're all cleared. They've worked together as starters every day since James Daniels was cleared to come back from his Achilles tear injury last year. So that's pretty good. Brunskill, to me, would be the top interior guy, regardless of Andrew Meyer's status. I know he's out for a couple of weeks. Regardless of if and when Liam Eichenberg gets back to the roster, Brunskill would be like my top guy, my top interior backup. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, Miami's going to get a chance to view the guy that they view as the swing tackle, Larry Borom, right away, as Austin Jackson's going to miss a couple weeks, but should be back for the season opener at Indianapolis. It's a month to the day, September 7th. We'll get to see Larry Borom plugged in at right tackle, and we'll see how that goes. I'm a little skeptical, just kind of based on everything I've heard out of camp, but we'll see how he does Sunday against the Bears. The other lineman addition that they made was Germain Ifedi, who had played a lot for Seattle, spent last year with Cleveland. If you follow Eric Smith of the 3 yards per carry crew, the 5 Reasons sports crew, he did a pretty nice film breakdown of him the other night. I think Germain would probably be my ideal choice to be the swing tackle, but since they've had Larry Borom in camp and Germain was just a recent signing, you're probably not going to throw him into the fire right off the bat. But let's say hypothetically Austin Jackson isn't ready to play week 1 in Indianapolis. I don't think it's unforeseeable by any means that Germain Ifedi could beat out Larry Borom and start that game at right tackle in week 1 if needed. There's still a good chunk of time in 3 preseason games to make that evaluation. I think the other thing with Germain Ifedi is he did get to play some left tackle last year for the Browns, so maybe he ends up being your top swing tackle choice. I think it's important to note that Keon Smith has mostly been used as a right guard this offseason. I'm sure they'll give him some reps at tackle. I had heard he was the left tackle for the second string unit after the Brunskill signing. But interesting to see how those guys will fit and how they'll be evaluated. Wouldn't surprise me if Brunskill ends up being the top interior swing guy, and if Germain Ifedi ends up being like the Kendall Lamb of the 2025 Miami Dolphins. Now, breaking down some of the position groups here, we'll go with 2 tonight, receivers and the secondary as a whole, so corners and safeties. We'll start on the offensive side of the ball, and this position group, I feel like the top 4 has a chance to be the strongest top 4 that Mike McDaniel and Tua Tagovailoa have had. You look at Cedric Wilson being the number 3 guy, but I don't think he ever caught more than like 25 passes in a year. Braxton Berrios never took off in this offense. River Craycraft, caught 9 balls the last season he was fully healthy in 2023. Like, they haven't had to rely on a third receiver. They tried to cycle through Odell Beckham Jr. last year, didn't work out, and they ended up basically playing Malik Washington, pretty extensively in the slot down the stretch. He caught 25 passes, had 5 carries, 1 touchdown. I think he's a great choice to be like a true slot player. And then obviously they signed Nick Westbrook-Akine this offseason from Tennessee, who in a lot of ways kind of has a dual role in my eyes. He can do a lot of the stuff in the slot that Miami were using Trent Sherfield for back in 2022, that they tried to train Eric Ezukama for in 2023. That was short-lived because he got hurt before the Week 3 game and missed the rest of the season. They didn't really have that guy last year, even though they threw a ton of screens. Nick Westbrook-Akine, bigger body guy. If you watch some of his film against Tennessee, they're using him on wham blocks. They're using him inserted between a tackle and tight end to lead. Like, this guy's not afraid of contact. I don't think he's going to catch a ton of passes. Like, I would be surprised if he caught more than 25, barring an injury to like Hill or Waddle, where one of those guys is out for most of the year. But I think his value will be in blocking. I think Malik Washington's value is sort of as a true blue slot receiver who can also do some of the gadget stuff, screens, reverses, end arounds, those type of things, and will likely be the starting kick and punt returner. He was pretty good at that, the second half of the season when they turned it over to him. Those top 4, Hill, Waddle, whatever order you decide Washington and Westbrook-Akine are, that's a pretty solid top 4 in my eyes. So I think the real battle sort of becomes, how many more do they keep? Is it 1 guy or 2? Seemingly if Darren Waller's on the roster, that's almost a big receiver, even though he's labeled as a tight end, because he's not going to be attached to the line of scrimmage very much, if at all. And we've seen Tanner Conner kind of emerge in camp. Stop me if you've heard that before, because we've heard that kind of the last 2 years, and it's never really materialized in the preseason games, and certainly hasn't materialized for him in the regular season outside of, being a guy who's on special teams. So I think some of the roster math is going to determine how much or how many more receiver positions are kept on the team in addition to that top 4. I wonder a lot if, Miami's number 3 tight end is currently not a Miami Dolphin, and that plays into it somehow. But I think the main 4 guys, and this is kind of based on, things I've talked about with people who have been at practices, along with what is out there for public consumption. The 4 guys who seemingly have the best shot to win that 5th receiver job, or 6th receiver job if they keep 2, would be Andrew Armstrong, Theo Weiss, D. Eskridge, and Taj Washington. And it's kind of interesting because you've got 2 really tiny guys in Eskridge and Taj Washington, and 2 big body guys in Armstrong and Weiss. So I kind of wonder, do they pull one of each? We'll start with D. Eskridge, since he was on the roster last year. Was basically inactive for most of the season after he kind of had a rough start to the season with Skylar Thompson and Tim Boyle and Snoop Huntley, and then got beat out by Malik Washington. But he's sort of the analog of Malik Washington, short, quick, slot guy, kick and punt return ability. Hasn't really proven himself anywhere he's been. And Taj Washington kind of seems like the same type of guy. Never got a chance last year to do an undisclosed leg injury he suffered at the end of minicamp. But those 2 guys have gotten a lot of reps with the 2s and the 3s so far in camp. I would keep your eye on them, because it seems like they certainly have a body type they like at receiver. Those guys kind of fit. The other battle would be Andrew Armstrong versus Theo Weiss. Now, if you're following camp reports and looking at videos and reading, everyday blogs, Theo Weiss has probably caught more passes and more touchdowns than anybody other than Hill and Waddle. But he's only done it with the 2s and the 3s. Here's a little nugget of intel I can drop on you. Andrew Armstrong has actually gotten reps with the 1s. This started earlier this week, but he has gotten reps with the 1s. And you think about Andrew Armstrong's game, he's the biggest receiver they have on the team at 6'4". He's not a good route runner. Okay, let's get that out of the way. Not a good route runner, not fast, but he's a good hands catcher, and he's got a massive catch radius. And you look at sort of his build, his body type, part of me wonders if they're trying to find him or, view him as an analog to Nick Westbrook-Akine, have a backup to Westbrook-Akine, should something happen. Can also play X receiver on the outside. Big body guy, can go up and high point, has a good catch radius, all that, just like Westbrook-Akine. So I'm really curious to see how they use Andrew Armstrong in the preseason. Is he going to be in the slot some? Is he going to be the guy that's doing, sniffer blocks and sift blocks and trying to cut off backside or inserting in a wham block? Any of that stuff. I think if they're doing that with him, they're doing it for a reason and they want to evaluate him. I have not heard of them using Theo Weiss in that manner. I've just heard of him basically being like a normal Z and X receiver on the outside. So very curious to see how those two guys would be used. And obviously you have Eric Azukama, I think is probably horse number 5 in this race, just because of his draft status and kind of had his star rise a little bit a couple years ago in 2023, and then it flamed out and he hasn't recaptured that. But they have a lot of talent at receiver, and it wouldn't surprise me if like 3 or 4 of those guys that don't make the roster end up on the practice squad. It'd be a valuable thing to have someone like a Minari Baldwin who's got that blazing speed on your practice squad to replicate for when you have to face a speedy receiver that week. Something along those lines. So if I had to bet, going into it kind of blind right now, I would take Andrew Armstrong as my 5th, and then I would probably lean towards D. Eskridge as my 6th guy, depending on how he does in the preseason. Moving on to the secondary, and I know there's been a lot of consternation about this. I think I've said it in multiple episodes leading up. I was more concerned about safety until they added Minkah Fitzpatrick. I think that's the stabilizing force. And I know Ashton Davis is out. He's going to be out indefinitely. We don't know for how long. I would imagine, based on what I've heard, he's probably not going to be ready for the start of the regular season. So I imagine they put him on like short-term IR with the recall, that type of deal. That being said, they got Ifeatu Melifonwu back this week. He's been practicing. And we know that they really liked Patrick McMorris from last year, who had a really nice preseason until he went down with the broken foot. So far as I know, since Ashton Davis has been down, the top 3 safeties have been Fitzpatrick, Melifonwu, and McMorris. And you can kind of figure how that trio works. Melifonwu at this stage is probably the guy who's capable of doing most of the Kyle Hamilton-like roles, considering where Anthony Weaver brought this defense from. Melifonwu, he's not blazing fast, but he's a long strider. He covers a lot of ground. He's got range. I think it's very probable you see him as the guy who sort of lined up as an edge defender who's doing overhang stuff in the slot, who can play, big slot versus your Travis Kelce and Mike Gesicki's and tight ends of that ilk. He's also a guy who can play in a 2-high shell, and if you have to, he can run back and play middle of the field because he's so long and rangy. He can play split field safety. He can act as a cloud safety when you're in some of these cover 2 looks. I think he is a pretty versatile piece, even though you don't necessarily assume he is. Minkah Fitzpatrick, again, a very versatile piece, smart player. I view him as sort of the air traffic controller, making sure everybody's in the right spot, getting everybody aligned, making the calls. Good player to have playing downhill, to play underneath against crossers, basically as a whole player, sitting in the middle of the field, kind of at the sticks, and just kind of reading the play out in front of him and going and making tackles. I don't necessarily think Minkah is a guy you want to sit back and play, middle of the field coverage like an Earl Thomas, like a Glover Quinn, like Javon Holland had to do as a rookie under Flores, like Ed Reed. I don't know that you want him doing that, but I think he's capable of doing it in the right situations, and he's certainly capable of playing as a 2-high safety when you're playing like quarters or cover 2 or something like that. McMorris is the wild card because to me, just based on what I've seen from his tape at Cal, at San Diego State, and last year the preseason, seems more apt to play the role that I think Minkah would play. But perhaps he's your other split field safety when you go big nickel and then you play Melifonwu near the box. And if you want a good view of what Melifonwu can do from that box safety position, I would go back and watch Detroit's playoff game from 2023 against Tampa Bay. He's everywhere. They blitz him. He gets a sack and a half on Baker Mayfield. He has a couple tackles for loss. I think he had like 7 or 8 tackles in the game total. That's the vision, I think, for Melifonwu. Plus, you can do some stuff with him deep in coverage. On top of that, we also know, or I have also been told, Elijah Campbell, who sort of seems like kind of the pet underdog of Anthony Weaver. Elijah Campbell's gotten a lot of work with the ones as a third safety. Now, this was before Melifonwu came back from the NFI list. But Campbell's a pretty versatile guy. He played slot corner under Josh Boyer back in 2022. He's played safety. He's good on special teams. He's a good athlete. You might have some like niche roles for him carved into your defense as well. So I would certainly keep an eye on those 4 being the top 4 for the moment. So Minkah, Melifonwu, Patrick McMorris, and Elijah Campbell until Ashton Davis comes back. And then kind of the wild card at the moment has been Dante Trader Jr., who hasn't practiced, in the better part of the last 2 weeks. McDaniel did make some comments about him earlier this week, saying that they really want to see him in game action. So I would take that as a sign that maybe he is ready to play and will get some action against the Bears on Sunday. But I think at this point, he's probably behind those other 4, 5, if you count Ashton Davis, if he were to come back, in terms of your safety depth chart. But it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out because they've got a number of guys who can play in multiple roles, which is kind of how this whole defense is built with the coverages. Now, on the corner, which has been everybody's favorite sore spot this offseason because, we didn't draft Jahdae Barron, we didn't trade up into the, pick 73 to 85 and get in the cornerback run in the 3rd round of the draft. They didn't sign Rasul Douglas. They haven't signed Asante Samuel Jr. Like, they just haven't done what the fan base has clamored for. On top of that, since our last episode, Kader Kohu tore his ACL. He's gone for the year. Which, quick segue, you feel awful for a guy like Kader Kohu who worked his way up through the undrafted route, was a slot corner from day one because of the Byron Jones injury, and they bumped Nick Needham outside. Played really well as a rookie, kind of had a rough year under Fangio, played his best ball last year when he was rotating. A lot of people probably don't realize he had reps as a 2-high safety last year because he rotated into it from outside corner. He had a lot of reps at outside corner last year where he's playing the flat or he's dropping into a deep third. He did a lot more than just be your nickel corner. So that is a significant loss. But what I would caution, and I think I cautioned this on the last episode, you're not out here trying to recreate like the Bill Belichick Patriots cover one scheme. You're not out here trying to find the next Pat Surtain and Sam Madison combination. This defense isn't that. This defense is very heavily zone oriented. You're going to see a lot of cover 3. You're going to see quarters. You're going to see cover 2, the zone coverage, Tampa 2. You probably will see some 2-man at some point. But what they're not doing is out there collecting freak of nature athletes. They're not trying to find guys who can be Madison, Surtain, Darrelle Revis. This isn't what they're looking for. They're looking for guys who are smart, guys who are multiple, have played in varied schemes, who can get to landmarks on time, who can read coverages, who can pattern match when needed. And a lot of the guys have high explosion metrics, even if they don't have a fast 40-yard dash. And what I mean by that is look at the broad jump, look at the short shuttle times, look at the vertical jump. A lot of the guys, Jason Marshall is an example of this, is top 7 in the entire combine this year in both the broad jump and the vertical jump among corners. 5th round pick, certainly not a guy you would have grabbed in your top 10 or 15 corners, most likely. I certainly didn't have him there. But he's got the metrics that Miami look at. And obviously they've signed Jack Jones, played last year in Las Vegas. They've signed Mike Hilton, played last year in Cincinnati. And what I would tell you, and this is kind of a segue of sorts into the depth chart thing, is I've told you, since OTA or since minicamp, Kendall Sheffield has worked with the starters with Storm Duck and Kader Kohou. Well, Kohou's down, and surprise, surprise, look at the depth chart. Storm Duck, Kendall Sheffield are your top corners. Looking at Mike Hilton, and be clear about how I say this. Stylistically, if there's one player, one slot corner in the league who's close to Kader Kohou, it is Mike Hilton. They're both shorter guys. They're both very thickly built. They both play better forwards than they do in reverse. Hilton's a very good blitzer. He's a very good tackler against the run. They're both guys that you wouldn't want covering like Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase if they ever line up in the slot. You don't want that. Exhibit A, go look at CeeDee Lamb's game against the Dolphins from 2023. That whole first quarter, he's just running right by Kader Kohou. Like, he's not as athletic as, let's say, Teron Johnson from the Bills or our old pal Noah Igbenogany from the Commanders, which I'll pat myself on the back because I remember getting into a debate with another very prominent Dolphins YouTuber back in the day and suggesting that they should try Igbenogany in the slot, and that's come to fruition some years later. But neither here nor there. So what I think you're likely to see is I would bet it's going to be pretty tough for Kendall Sheffield to hold serve and hold off Jack Jones. So what I think you'll see come week 1, barring another addition of sorts, would be your 2 outside corners are going to be Storm Duck, who played pretty well the last 4 or 5 games of the year, and Jack Jones. Your slot guy is going to be Mike Hilton. The depth beyond them, you're probably going to have Kendall Sheffield, just based on his performance so far, unless he completely bombs in the preseason games. You're most likely going to have Jason Marshall Jr., because he has played well in camp as of late, and you just invested a 5th-round pick in him. The coaches like him. Scouts like him. So you've probably got those 5, and then you probably have a spot that's kind of a 3-horse, maybe 4-horse race between Ethan Bonner, who's played with the ones sporadically in camp and in the offseason. Isaiah Johnson, who played sporadically with the ones during the offseason. Cam Smith, mostly because of his draft status. And then Cornell Armstrong, who is basically the other guy competing for the nickel job. I would tend to think, based on everything I've heard, that final spot would probably be Ethan Bonner's at the moment. So your corners would be Storm Duck, Jack Jones, Mike Hilton, Jason Marshall Jr., Ethan Bonner. If you were to keep a sixth guy, because we already kind of talked about what happens at safety when Ashton Davis comes back, but if you were to keep a sixth corner, I could see them making enough excuses for Cam Smith to have another shot. But I think you'd be better off just cutting bait at this point, barring some sort of meteoric rise from him throughout the rest of the preseason. And, looking at the depth chart, you can kind of see where they think of Cam Smith. Now, I tend not to read much into the depth charts other than, see who's grouped with who. Look at the positions where you have a lot of players. O-line, receiver, corner, kind of see who's grouped with who is competing against who in terms of body type, position, what routes do they run well compared to who they're behind on the chart between Hill and Waddle, that kind of a thing. The defensive formation they listed would basically be a 4-3 under. They ran that some last year, could run it some this year. But I think more or less it was a mechanism on the depth chart so they didn't have to list Chop Robinson or Bradley Chubb as a backup. Because from what I've been told, they've been basically playing 3-4. They've been playing the 4-2 nickel stuff. They've played a whole bunch of exotic fronts and dime. There have been some 4-3 packages, but not as much as what you would probably imagine based on how last year's defense was. So just be cautious with that. It is certainly not cut and dry. And I saw someone on Twitter basically make a big deal because Kenneth Grant is listed as a second string guy. Well, they put the veteran D tackles, Zach Sealer and Benito Jones, first. Are you surprised by that? And this person basically tried to insinuate Kenneth Grant should be starting. We should have drafted Jahdae Barron instead. Which I can tell you from plenty of people who've talked to me who've been to camp, Kenneth Grant is getting a lot of reps with the ones. He just isn't listed there. So be very cautious with the depth chart. Now, the other thing I see a lot of is people talking about injuries and, Kader Kohu's down and Ashton Davis is down, and at the time we were down Ifeatu Melifonwu. Now Austin Jackson's down, and I would have to say it's football. Injuries are going to happen. Just today, the Chargers left tackle Rashawn Slater, who got that big extension, got carted off the field. Sounds like it's season ending from what I've seen. That's a huge blow. I was fortunate enough to get invited to the Cincinnati Bengals season ticket holder fan fest thing this past Saturday and got to watch their practice. There's a number of starters that they have that aren't even practicing. Chase Brown, the running back, didn't practice. Amarius Mims, their starting right tackle, did not practice. Both starting defensive ends, did not practice. Miles Murphy did practice. That was Shamar Stewart did practice, and he was fun to watch. I think one of their starting safeties did not practice. They were very cautious with the number of reps that they gave to Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. Not that those guys need a ton of reps, but, you don't want to risk it. There was kind of a weird play where Joe Burrow got pushed from the pocket and scrambled out to the right. Nobody was really there. He could have probably taken off and run for I don't know, 8 yards or so and slid down. But because it was a third down play, he tried to make like a jump pass right before he got to the sideline, like a shortstop, who fields a backhanded ball and tries to throw to first. The ball slipped out of Burrow's hand, and the whole stadium kind of like collectively held their breath and thought, oh my God, is his wrist gone again? It happens. It's football. And I think what's more is I'd actually gotten to go see several practices back in the 05-06 era with the Bengals, Carson Palmer, Chad Johnson, TJ Hushmanzada, Rudy Johnson, all those guys, just from working for a former Cincinnati Bengal. Those practices back then were a lot tougher than what they're doing now. So, it doesn't surprise me that there are guys with soft tissue injuries, guys that get banged up. I would say, knock on wood, the Dolphins' injuries, aside from Kader Kohou, aren't too bad. Just something to keep in mind as you kind of watch and progress through the season, especially the preseason. There's still a month until this season kicks off for real. A lot can happen. And I'm sure no matter what I say, fans are going to overreact. And the first time the defense gives up a touchdown, it's holy shit, we're not going to stop anybody, blah, blah, blah. It's the most vanilla basic game plan you're going to see. This is more about evaluating players individually in a vacuum. Who can play, who can't. And if you do look at that depth chart, regardless of where guys are lined up, that's kind of the one big overarching clear piece is a lot of the Dolphins depth chart is probably going to be chalk this year. Meaning who the guys are at a lot of spots. What position battles other than corner are really open. Punter, kick returner maybe. Most of the battles are for depth spots. It's backup quarterback. It's who's the third running back, who's the fifth receiver. I guess tight end would be a spot. But just enjoy that football is back. Don't overanalyze everything in the preseason. Just figure out who can play. That's the goal. So with that, that's going to do it for me. I plan on watching the game live, so we'll try to do a review of that game Sunday night or Monday night and get that out early next week. We'll do another position group breakdown. We'll probably do linebackers and tight ends, and then we'll save the backfield, quarterbacks, running backs, special teams for the last episode as we kind of gear towards week 1 at Indianapolis. Speaking of which, I will be there. Hope to see you fans out there at the game in Lucas Oil. That's going to do it for me. I'm Kevin Dern. You can follow me on X at KevinMD4. You can follow the show at DolphinsTalk.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube. Be sure you check out all the other great writers and podcast hosts on the DolphinsTalk.com family. That's going to do it for me. Have a great week and enjoy week 1 of the preseason on Sunday. Fins up. This episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly was brought to you by Caneswear. Caneswear is the place to go for officially licensed apparel for the Miami Dolphins, Miami Heat, the Hurricanes, Florida Panthers, and all of the professional and college teams in South Florida. Looking for the latest jersey, a birthday gift, or the newest hat to hit the market of your favorite South Florida team? Check out Caneswear for their overwhelming selection of sports apparel. Located at 2655 South University Drive in Davie, Florida, Caneswear has it all. Not in South Florida? No worries. Visit Caneswear.com to shop their inventory from the comfort of your home, and they'll ship to you. International fans, too. Caneswear.com is the spot that Miami fans shop. That's Caneswear.com, Caneswear.com.